All right. You have made it. We are in the last video of this series. Watch this. Let's see if it'll work. Woo! Confetti. Woo! Can we do it again? Woo! All right, cool. So we're in the last video of this series on qualitative data. So we're gonna bring everything full circle here, move from data to findings, right? So this is the whole point. This is what we're going for, right? We're looking for what we call the analytical leap, right? So in this lecture, we're gonna talk about the most challenging part of qualitative research, right? Didn't we already talk about that, Tyler? Is it all challenging? No, it's not. So, how do we transform all of those individual codes, those thousands of little codes in our family, into actual research findings? This is what separates real research from just data processing. Okay. So, after 2 weeks of coding, which would be optimistic for this kind of study we're talking about, you are going to probably feel overwhelmed by all that coded data, right? Let's say after 3 months of coding. Well, who knows how long it'll take you, right? I don't want to scare you. Takes me a while. So, having hundreds of coded segments it's not automatically give you those research findings, unfortunately. Again, unless you want to produce some boring research. But today we're going to talk about how, okay, Tyler, I got that pile of codes. How are we going to move from description to interpretation, from patterns to theoretical insights, right? And you're saying, wait, didn't we start with theoretical insights, right? Well, this is research and academia, right? We're reading theory, we're conducting our own research based on that, we're building and trying to generate new theory or at least additions to existing theory to continue to advance knowledge. That's why science is so important. Let's not let it die, my friends. Okay, so today we're taking the analytical leap. The challenge is individual codes do not equal research findings. We got to find these description. We got to unpack descriptive patterns, right? Which were our golden ticket previously now to analytical insights, and we got to process the data into patterns, themes, theoretical claims. Okay, so we're going to move from mechanical coding. Again, we are not robots. We are not clunkers to theoretical interpretation, right? So the quality of this analytical work really is going to determine whether your research contributes new knowledge or just documents what people said. Again, exploratory research, it's not bad. There's practical implications, right? You're conducting research for an NGO and you're just looking to document specific phenomenon, right? I'm not trying to throw shade on that sort of science, but we're talking about complex, justice informed, systematic, you know, deep, thick research in this lecture, right? So that's what I'm going to prioritize here. But again, it's okay to do that, but we're going to continue to use a marine conservation data example. We're going to focus on what patterns are revealing and how we are trying to interpret how environmental justice is actually working in the system, right? So by the end of today, my goal is for you to understand how to transform coded data into these theoretical claims that can contribute to broader scholarly knowledge, inform policy decisions, help solve problems locally, right? We are taking this into action, okay? So let's dive in. The architecture of qualitative analysis, right? Fun, fun, fun. So let me show you the structure of qualitative analysis, right? So level one, we talked about individual codes. These categorize specific data segments, right? And so in this process, if we imagine we've already done this, right? We've done our coding. We've got all these segments, which are excerpts from the interviews. They're all coded. It's all nice and neat in our in vivo, and we've got the hierarchies all designed because we looked at the patterns and we saw these relationships between the codes. We made some identification of those based in triangulation. We looked at theory. We looked at supporting documents. And now we're like, okay, hey, starting to see some themes here. We're taking some abstract concepts and we're explaining some patterns, right? I'm starting to see some connections, starting to see some themes might be related to, let's say, resource depletion or climate change, right? And now we're going to say, okay, what does all this mean, right? What do we find? What can we contribute from these findings? Like, why do we do this, right? What was the point? So an example, right, with our marine conservation data, right, we've got procedural, exclude, recog, devalue, dist, external. These are examples of codes. A pattern we could potentially see here is systematic community marginalization despite participatory rhetoric, right? We talked about this, like it's tokenistic. They're having workshops, so they're not actually doing anything or accomplishing or following through. This could be a theme that we could start to see and start to, look in the literature, go to our knowledge base, triangulate, think about what other people have studied and started to call this in different forms of literature. It might be new. We might see something new, but we are going to theme this, this could be, looks like procedural inclusion without substantive power, right? People are being included, but they've got no power in those decisions, right? They're being invited to meetings, they're taking the donuts and the orange juice, but nothing's coming of it, right? They don't feel like they have any power, right? So, interesting. This might be a challenge to participatory governance, which is, touted as, the crux, the foundation of ethical and just conservation, environmental justice work, right? This might be something we need to look into, right? Have we gone astray? Are we all just sort of checking boxes, right? What makes good participatory governance? Okay, I'm starting to see a place I can contribute to the literature, right? Do we find a gap? You follow me? You see where I'm going with this, right? So, this is where we're going to start, taking those each level requires different types of thinking. The codes are descriptive, patterns are comparative, the themes are interpretive, the theory is contributory. Contributory. That's a fun word. This structure is going to help you move systematically from those empirical observations to those theoretical insights. Okay. So, not just saying, I saw something, you're saying, what does this mean? And what does this mean to the broader humanity, right? Something of that nature. Don't just go counting codes, right? So let's start with pattern identification, right? This goes way beyond just counting codes. An example of a mechanical approach, which I mentioned, is just, hey, we're going to count how often these codes appear. We're going to report the most frequent ones. This assumes that frequency is interesting and equals importance, right? That could be true, but it's not necessarily true. I made this mistake before, right? I thought, okay, gosh, it took me so long. Oh, I saw this many themes show up. Awesome. And then I looked at the data and I was like, oh, this is boring. What is this? Doesn't say anything really. A more sophisticated an analytical approach, right? And I don't know if I like the word sophisticated, but it's going to examine how these codes relate to each other, right? It's going to look for unexpected patterns and it's going to consider what might be absent from your data, right? Ooh, right. What might be missing? That's scary to think about, but it might be important, right? It might be that counterfactual evidence that is going to be the crux to your argument, right? So, in our marine conservation example, right, we had proc include, procedural inclusion. Let's say this appears 127 times across the interviews, right? Seems powerful, right? A mechanical analysis might conclude, oh, procedural justice was well addressed. We saw procedural inclusion, many mentions of meetings, right? But a sophisticated analysis, right? And that's like this is gonna really date me as like a millennial with that like Drake meme, like, right? But when we analyze proc include alongside, we're looking at a connection here in vivo. Thank you. It's going to show us like how many times did these two codes or these three codes or these five codes co-occur with each other. Again, we did triangulation. We saw a lot of people mentioned this, but they also mentioned this code, right? How many times did proc include appear with recognitional devalue or structural barriers, right? That could be a very different pattern. That could be a very powerful pattern, right? Communities might have been included in meetings, but they were excluded from the real decision-making power, and that was institutionalized by, let's say, the funder of the NGO, because they only wanted to rely on quantitative data, right? Again, this is environmental justice research, right? We are using that procedural inclusion. We're operating it alongside a substantive exclusion, right? So again, this is revealing how consultation and really deep engagement with the data can legitimize predetermined decisions rather than genuinely incorporate community input. Okay, so pattern identification really requires attention to significant absences, right? What's missing from the data that can be used, it can be just as important as what is present. Okay, and I've hammered that point home to you quite a bit, but that does require some critical engagement, right? AI, it struggles with that. It's going to always look for what's present. Okay, now let's talk about developing themes from your patterns. Okay, so step one is we're going to combine all the related patterns into broader concepts, right? And you can do this through a variety of ways, right? So in Vivo and other software can help you kind of group these into like a word cloud or like a network map. You can also draw it. I've done it through like Canva, like making like flow diagrams and things like that. But you're going to start to move these things around. You could do sort of like solving the true crime up on a board, whatever works for you, right? But you're looking for these patterns and you're trying to amalgamate these, group these into broader concepts, okay? Step two, right? You're developing an analytical vocabulary to name these themes, right? You're looking for, okay, based on the literature, based in what the participants said, based in my framework, I think we could call this this. We're seeing, a lot of this kind of co-occurring here, right? So you're developing that a language for your study, right? That's exciting. And then you're going to map the evidence that's going to support each theme, right? And so this is where the coding hierarchy comes in because your themes are going to be grouped by the subcodes, which could be the specific codes that you used, or it could be, however you develop your coding structure. In Vivo's great about sort of putting this together, but you can't just say, well, I saw this theme show up and it was really impactful, right? Well, what codes are backing that up, right? What evidence do you have? Again, got to support these claims. We're not just, we're not. Anyway, we got to test the theme boundaries as well, right? Where does each theme apply and where doesn't it, right? So let me show you like an example here using the marine conservation data. So let's say our theme is participatory legitimacy without community authority, right? Participatory legitimacy without community authority. That sounds really good. That could be like a protest chant. Anyway, definition. We are going to create a definition for this, right? Based on the literature, based on the data, where you can say formal consultation processes that legitimize conservation decisions while preventing communities from actually influencing outcomes. Boom. Powerful, right? Sounds good. And even stronger, here's the evidence, right? We have policy documents that are emphasizing extensive consultation, right? But the community is saying they're excluded from real decision making, right? And the conservation outcomes, the consultation couldn't change, right? The conservation outcomes are doing nothing, right? So this theme is providing that analytical vocabulary for understanding how this participatory rhetoric operates in conservation governance, right? So good themes are going to capture that empirical complexity while also connecting to broader theoretical debates, and that is a difficult process, but it's a learned skill and a very important skill to learn through qualitative data, something I still struggle with, right? This is, the most powerful themes are going to reveal these social processes that we're seeking to get out and unpack that maybe weren't recognized before, rather than just looking to only name obvious patterns, right? The brain is going to go for those obvious patterns, but as academics, as scholars, as, critical scientists, we're looking to unpack that. Where's the nuance? Where's the hidden dimensions, right? So let's see. I'm gonna integrate these themes to show you sort of how we could do this. I'm gonna read these out loud, and we're gonna try to get these into this integrated theme, and I'm gonna kind of walk you through like my decision making process here. Okay, so pattern one, we see that policy documents are emphasizing consultation extent, right? So, okay, this is the quantitative, this is the frequency, 12 villages, 847 participants, right? Okay, powerful. Pattern two, community interviews are describing predetermined outcomes, right? Everything's already decided at these meetings. Everything's decided before we get there, right? We go, there's free stuff, free drinks and stuff, free punch and donuts, but everything's decided already, right? Pattern three, technical expertise is constantly being used to dismiss traditional knowledge, right? It's not, like we said, not scientific data. We can't include it in the grant. What can we do, right? Legal constraints are limiting community input, right? It's only feasible given our scientific constraints, right? So we see this like institutionalized, this systemic language, this structural injustice being put in there through the epistemology, right? And this is the example I've given in a few other slides. So this should not be like news to you, right? But what do these patterns tell us about when we put them together, right? This is a new content, right? It could really be showing us that government agencies are conducting extensive consultation to demonstrate a democratic process, right? We are demonstrating this, right? We are checking the boxes, right? But they're still maintaining centralized control over those conservation planning outcomes. And this is incredibly common, okay? This becomes our theme: consultation as a legitimacy mechanism, right? So this is really showing that they're using consultation as a legitimacy mechanism rather than a participatory decision making, right? The theme is really going to explain how consultation functions politically, not just procedurally, right? So now we've moved into many different dimensions of justice right here. We are talking about procedural, structural, recognitional, distributional, right? This is all kind of tying into this broader integrated theme that is really, really an interesting finding and a contribution from our study, right? That would have been missed if we just said, yeah, well, there's a lot of meetings. Procedural justice looks okay, right? Critical scholarship, it's important. So again, this is it serves legitimacy needs for government agencies in this example, but it's not a genuinely democratic conservation decision making forum. Okay, look at that fish. Okay, and I have way too much text on this slide. I can barely move my little video bubble. So now we're coming full circle. Right now we're going to connect this to theory. Okay, and this is, it's kind of like the gold standard, right? This is like what we're aiming to do. Is this always going to be possible? Perhaps not, right? We're not going to always be able to generate novel insights. We could, build on existing literature, but, again, if you discover new theory, that's incredible, but a lot of work is not going to actually do that, right? So we're going to be building, we're going to be adding to the conversation, but we need to find, a way to connect back again, like to the findings, to the citations, right? This is kind of just like citing 101, right? We're connecting back to what other academics in this space are talking about, right? We are working together to build a collaborative knowledge base, right? So we're going to go back to the theoretical literature. And in this sort of instance where we talked about participatory legitimacy without community authority, just rolls off the tongue. I love that. This really connects to several important scholarly frameworks, right? So this connects to Arnstein's ladder of participation, which distinguishes consultation from citizen control. Cook and Kothari's tyranny of participation. Love this one. Participation as a governance technique, like a shady governance technique to like make people feel like they're participating when they're actually just kind of cogs in a machine. Ah. Lee's will to improve, where technical governance excludes political dimensions, right? This is very common in conservation, where we're, talking about, we're constantly advancing and we're enhancing and we're adding new technocratic solutions, but we're not actually changing the political structures that are creating oppression, right? So each connection to the literature, right, from our finding is helping us understand these different aspects of our own empirical finding, right? Different ways of looking at it, different ways of connecting to it. But here's our analytical contribution, right? In our study, our hypothetical example, let's say we reveal how this participatory conservation reproduces technocratic governance while claiming democratic legitimacy, right? Oh, we just connected that to the theory, right? We're showing, oh, we're showing this, what people are talking about in the literature. We're demonstrating this in a unique way, right? This finding has implications beyond our specific case. Oh my gosh, we are doing good, right? This is what you're looking for. It suggests problems with how participatory conservation may be designed and evaluated more broadly. Maybe there's a framework, like a framework that's commonly used to determine how participatory conservation works, and we can find that and we can say, look, the things that we found, they're saying is a metric that they use, and we're showing that that's invalid, right? This would be like you'd feel so good at this moment, right? So theoretical interpretation is going to transform that case specific findings, right? Because unfortunately, right? Okay, so locally, for the local community, that sort of basic finding, not basic, but that core fundamental finding that you're seeing participatory legitimacy without community authority, that is highly relevant to them, right? And so we're not only always trying to preach to the academic community, right? We're not always only trying to pitch there, right? That's a really good finding. You should take that back. You should discuss that, check it, see how that can be applied to a local context, right? In a policy framework, that's also a great finding, right? Local context. But academic literature, scientific findings, we're always trying to, we really want to make generalizable claims that could be applied broader because it's going to help our clout. Well, maybe not help our clout, but get us more citations, and hopefully our concepts are going to be expanded more. It could, help us make, findings in the field. I mean, that's how we advance, huge, novel theories and findings, right? So we are kind of always trying to think about how this could be generalizable and transferable, but it doesn't mean that exploratory science is not important or context specific science is not important. I just want to make that really clear, right? Like, yes, this is important. Yes, this could be really cool, but let's not, diminish local contributions and more sort of like modest rather than giant analytical, generalizable, theoretical contributions. Okay. That was a tangent. I hope that made sense. If you want to talk more, come to office hours. So, you know, again, we always have to have evidence, right? We are like the best detectives in the world. I hate this picture. It creeps me out. I should have never picked it. I'm gonna put myself right there. So evidence construction for theoretical claims, right? Our claim is that we found that marine conservation policies were reproducing technocratic, and technocratic is like only focusing on like technology or like applied solutions or like like fixes, right? Like tangible fixes and policy and programs, right? Without addressing broader problems, right? Technocratic governance despite participatory rhetoric, right? And so we have to back this up, right? It's going to require us to demonstrate systematic evidence to support this claim, right? And so what we're going to need to do is to support this strong assertion, we have to, uh, and this strong assertion has significant policy implications. We need some evidence, right? So we need convergent evidence, right? We need multiple data sources to support this claim. That's that triangulation within the data sources, right? Multiple sources, interview data, policy documents, NGO reports, as much as we can get, right, to converge to get this evidence as triangulated and as supported from multiple dimensions as possible, right? Mechanistic evidence would be a causal linkage, right? We can clearly see that there's a process that's explaining why technocratic governance operates in this way, why it's prioritized. This is not always easy to find with qualitative data. I already mentioned that. Comparative evidence is looking for if this pattern that we observed is consistent across different contexts, right? So we saw this in Indonesia. We might want to check this in the Philippines as well, right? Or we might want to check this in another area further away from our study location, right? If possible. Or did somebody else conduct a similar study that I could compare my results to? How can we compare this, right? Again, this is the gold standard, right? And then counter evidence, right? So is there alternative explanation, right? Did we find any sort of counter evidence that would disconfirm our case, right? Can you get all these evidence sources? I mean, that would be incredible, right? Can you get a few of them? That's your goal, right? Could you want to try to get as many as possible, depending on the rigor and that you're going for, and depending on how serious of a claim you're making, and how are you wanting this to alter international policy around marine protected areas? Well, then you need to have quite a bit of evidence, right? Do you want to, submit this as a, master's thesis? Well, they'll probably accept, some basic, construction of evidence from one of these sources, right? It depends. It depends. But, your goal is to try to get as much of this as possible, right? And again, this sort of evidence hierarchy, like I mentioned, well, let's actually, before we jump to that, let's say, like, in our example, right, for our conservation claim, I want to give you an example here. So like for our marine conservation claim, the evidence types could be convergent. So we have multiple data sources supporting this. We have the mechanistic, we have processes that are explaining this. We have the comparative evidence, right? So we saw this in another MPA, marine protected area, and we also saw some alternative explanations and contradictory cases, but it still supports our claim, right? So we see this Fisher interviews in the convergent data and policy documents in geo reports. They all are showing this similar pattern. In the mechanistic, we see that scientific expertise, is limiting community authority, and that's done through legal constraints and administrative procedures. The counter evidence could be that some consultation does incorporate community input, but those legal constraints again are just making only legitimizing technical needs. And then we're acknowledging that counter evidence, and we're not ignoring it, right? We're acknowledging that we did see that, but we still stand by our claim. And this is going to really strengthen your analysis, right? And again, a hierarchy would be like direct quotes, participants, specifically saying this is incredibly powerful. Document analysis, pattern analysis, theoretical analysis is kind of how we can think about this evidence stacking up in our process. So, analytical memo is back. Remember, I told you this is very important, right? So analytical memo is going to evolve throughout your research process, and this is where it comes back into play and is very important, right? So your early coding memos, right? You were talking about. Remember? Oh, it seems like fishers support conservation, but they experience some distributional burdens, right? They're not fully bought in. They're having some resource problems or some income problems, right? So you might have then started to see like a pattern, and you may have written, systematic external benefit capture across tourism and employment. I'm noticing this. Communities are bearing costs while the benefits are flowing to external tour operators, right? And so then in your theme memo, you might, build on this to say, okay, I saw those two things, and what I'm really seeing is conservation benefits. Exportation represents broader technocratic governance that excludes community authority. And then your theoretical is sort of end of the day memo, pulling all that together is that, okay, well, this is what you're putting in your manuscript, right, or your report or whatever. But findings are contributing to environmental governance literature that's showing how participatory rhetoric legitimizes technocratic control, right? So it's kind of supporting everything all together. Again, this is like hard to give you an example of because this would be incredibly specific to what you're doing and may not necessarily scale like this, but I'm just trying to show you that you need to keep doing analytical memos, okay? Like if I could tell you one thing in your life, keep as much analytical memo as possible, no matter what kind of research you're doing, right? So there is what I'm trying to demonstrate to you here, maybe successfully or unsuccessfully, is this intellectual development from description to theoretical contribution, right? We observed a phenomenon, we looked for the pattern, we connected this to existing literature, and here's where we're making our own claim, right? So again, this is sort of scientific process, right? This is the progression of your growing analytical sophistication throughout the research process. Again, dealing with contradictions, not always a bad thing, right? But real data always contains contradictions and complexity. Okay. Don't let anybody tell you anything differently. How do we handle this? We don't scream. We don't freak out. We don't panic. You might. Sometimes I do when I see this, even though I know this to be true. But, uh, you know, we're gonna sort of sometimes always go towards, okay, we're gonna oversimplify, right? We're gonna ignore these contradictions. Let's keep things clean, keep these themes clean. I do not want to deal with these random things coming in. Or you might start fragmenting. You might start treating these contradictions as separate, unrelated patterns, and not really, diving deeper to see that they connect to everything else. Or you might have paralysis, which is what I get most of the time. You're stuck. You're unable to develop any more themes due to this complexity. Like you cannot wrap your head around it. None of these approaches will serve you well. They are natural. You will ultimately encounter them. I go through phases of this all the time, right? So, but what's helpful is to think about a dialectical analysis, okay? And I learned this throughout my dissertation when I was doing thematic analysis, is that contradictions reveal underlying tensions in social processes rather than analytical problems. Contradictions reveal underlying tensions and social processes rather than analytical problems. Okay. Here's an example from our marine conservation, right? Community members simultaneously support conservation goals and resist conservation policies. This is not necessarily logical inconsistency, right? It reveals a tension between environmental values and governance processes, right? This is critical, right? You're understanding kind of the cultural fabric, maybe like the moral fabric of this community and how they're engaging with conservation processes, right? So they may support protecting MPAs, protecting coral reefs, but they're not a fan of the governance processes and the way they're working, these structural, procedural, recognitional violations that have maybe built up over time, right? This contradiction is illuminating how these conservation policies can align with the values, but they're violating political values, right? They're aligning with environmental values, but they're violating political values, right? So this is important, right? The different dimensions of environmental justice, as we mentioned, all operate simultaneously, and they sometimes conflict. They sometimes hit up against each other, right? That's why we can't have one-dimensional solutions and analyses, right? Multidimensional integration is crucial. Here we go. So this is across justice themes. I hope you're still following me at this point. I haven't lost you in the desert here. That's why I put this desert here. Because I was like, how many people are actually going to still be engaging with this? I hope all of you, right? So multidimensional integration. If I could name my first child multidimensional integration, maybe I would, right? I think it's very important. So let's put all these justice dimensions together, right? So the challenge, the 5 dimensions of our framework, they interact in complex ways that single dimension analysis is just not going to capture it. We've demonstrated it, we've seen it, we feel strongly about it. Marine conservation example shows us this, right? Distributive, we see this external benefit capture, this local cost concentration, we see this consultation without authority, these predetermined outcomes, we see this traditional knowledge being dismissed, this scientific expertise privileged. We see these legal frameworks in place that are excluding customary rights. They are excluding the contribution of local ecological knowledge. They're just checking boxes to fill donor requirements or NGO reports about holding meetings, right? And then we see an ecological dimension, which I haven't actually discussed in any other parts of this presentation, which maybe we should have. But marine protection is only achieved through community exclusion. We are creating a fortress conservation on the seas, right? We are, that is where the ecological injustice is surfacing, right? So when we integrate all these across all dimensions, what do we see, right? We see that conservation effectiveness through democratic exclusion is creating multiple justice tensions simultaneously, okay? This integrated analysis is suggesting that this environmental justice problem reflects governance approaches, not conservation goals themselves. It's a systemic problem, right? Communities support marine protection, but they resist this governance process that's excluding them from authority over traditional territories, right? If these governance processes don't change, or there's no reparative justice or reconciliation or trust building, it's very likely that continual adjustments to governance processes are never going to be acceptable, right? So we might just continue to do the same thing and repeat the same problems over and over and over again. This happens a lot more than you think. So from analysis to argument, right? How do we get these sort of analytical claims to make sense, right? So again, this is going to be a little bit maybe deeper than it needs to be when we get into this, because I'm not going to have you write like a peer-reviewed qualitative research study, but I think it's important to have this background. So strong claims are going to include clear analytical assertion, empirical evidence supporting the claim, theoretical interpretation explaining significant scope conditions, where and when this applies, and implications for policy and theory, right? This is like the gold standard. If you're going to make a very strong argument from your data, from your empirical observations, you really want to try to tick all these boxes, right? As best you can. This is going to make a very rigorous study, right? So, an example of a very strong claim in our case would be that marine conservation policies in Southeast Asia achieve ecological protection through governance processes that systematically exclude fishing communities from meaningful authority, creating multiple justice tensions that may undermine long-term conservation effectiveness, right? So the claim structure, notice it, right? Clear assertion about the governance processes. We're connecting ecological and social outcomes. We're identifying potential consequences, right? Good claims communicate your main findings directly without requiring readers to work through that analytical complexity. This takes a lot of skill. I still struggle with this. Ask my advisor. They are going to demonstrate empirical grounding while explaining broader theoretical significance. And then the rest of your paper, the rest of your report, the rest of your speech, your presentation, your documentary is going to provide that evidence to support this claim, right? Is going to really, tell the rest of the story. But this is an incredibly strong claim that is just, following that sort of ladder of development perfectly, right? Wish I could write things like this. Haven't been able to yet. Okay, and then, theoretical contributions again. Let's not just like get hung up that this is the only kind of like value that we bring to the table, but let's talk about it because it's important, right? But let's discuss different types of theoretical contributions, right? So it could be an extension. It can apply existing theory to a new context. This is pretty common. This is like what most of us can achieve. Not most of us. Many of you are exceptional. I don't want to sell ourselves short. It could be a modification, right? We could revise theory based on contradictory evidence, right? This is a serious claim, so you better come correct. You better have those receipts, right? Because they're going to come for you. Especially the person who wrote the original theory, they might be not happy with you. But hey, that's science, right? We want to critique each other, want to build on knowledge. Critical evaluation is important, right? It might be integrative, right? We might combine different theoretical frameworks, diverse, disparate theoretical frameworks into a new sort of conceptualization and show its value and show how it could be used somewhere else, right? Or it could be a totally new theoretical concept, right? That's like amazing, but difficult to do and requires a lot of work, but not impossible. Very possible. Many people do it every day. Um, so for our marine conservation example, again, if you're not completely tired of it, right? Extension would be like, hey, environmental justice frameworks applied to marine conservation, we did it. It's useful, right? You should do it too. Here's what we found. We are supporting some other things people found. You should do that, right? This is like kind of the research that I've done mostly for my PhD dissertation, right? So modification, right? We could say, hey, participatory governance theory, hmm, participation can actually legitimize exclusion rather than democratize decisions, right? Whoa. Oh, that's a bold claim, right? That's an interesting claim. Could be true, and you better support that. You better be ready to defend it, right? Integration, we could say, hey, conservation effectiveness plus democratic governance plus social justice. We should look more into this, right? We should try to put these together because it worked for us and it could work for you, and it's got power, right? And we're going to show you why. And let's see some other people do it, right? Or it could say, hey, we came up with this new thing. It's called participatory legitimacy to the moon or something, some new name, right? And this is a governance mechanism that you got to try, right? It's amazing. Um, the strongest research is going to make multiple contribution types simultaneously, right? That's what you're going to. It's going to extend existing frameworks while challenging theoretical assumptions and developing new analytical concepts, right? That's what you're really looking to go for when you're, doing this, but it's difficult, right? It takes a lot of skill. So all of this coming together, the research implications, the findings of this. Let me close by just discussing like how your findings translate into broader implications, right? Because we're not only looking to make theory, right? That's not all we're trying to do. We're not living in the 1500s, but how do your findings challenge or extend existing theories, right? There's that theoretical implication. It's important in academia. Methodological implications, right? What analytical approaches work best in your research? This is really important to help people recreate the research that you're doing or improve what we're doing, right? But policy implications are really important too, right? How should environmental policies be redesigned based on your findings, right? Our marine conservation research might suggest, hey, that, in a theoretical sense, participatory governance theory needs revision to account for legitimacy functions. Hey, we gotta get back here, folks, because it's not working, right? Or methodologically, right? Multidimensional justice analysis. Hey, this is essential for capturing governance complexity. This really works for us, and you all should be doing this too, because I think we're missing some things, right? Or for policy, hi, IUCN or, UN, conservation planning should really provide genuine community authority, not just consultation opportunities. And here's how we're going to show you how you can do that, right? So these are some really powerful research, opportunities and identifies connections between these different implication types, right? This is the way that research can be really strong, right? But also there's local implications too. We talk about community-based conservation, community-based research, environmental justice from a participatory standpoint in future lectures. I'm really going to dive deeper into that. So don't think I'm ignoring that, right? I don't think these are the only ways to do good, impactful science or justice-based research, okay? So again, your analytical insights, they can and should inform both scholarly understanding, but also practical policy design, right? That's the goal of sophisticated environmental justice research. We're contributing knowledge that helps create more just and effective environmental policies, both at many different scales, right? So again, we're going to continue practicing and diving deeper into these analytical techniques. This is like the deep dive into qualitative data analysis. I gave it to you early. We're going to go into quantitative later. We're going to go into different others, epistemologies and methods. But again, I wanted to take that theory and make it practical for you. So, check out your assignments for this week. Be sure you're staying on top of those things. And again, always reach out to me via email, office hours. I appreciate your time. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, week, weekend, evening, whatever it is for you.